Hello, Catherine. We're going to talk today about how you got your diagnosis, the process behind it, and how you felt about it.
Okay, so how I got my diagnosis. So I was first diagnosed in about 2016, and I would have been about 36, 37 around that age. And my final diagnosis was ADHD. And I had my diagnosis in the Dean Clinic in St. Patrick's Hospital with a full team, kind of a multidisciplinary team. And I suppose leading up to that, at that time, I sought the diagnosis myself. I would have been referred by my GP. I had been doing some counselling on and off. There were certain indicators. There had been, this was obviously this was a pretty important diagnosis time. But in the run up to that, I probably would have had, I had generalised anxiety. I would have had that from being very, very young. And so I had been on like sertraline for that. And you always have those kind of internal indicators or whatever, but externally around that age, when 36, 37, just before I went to get that diagnosis, definitely things were kind of getting more chaotic. There was, it was having a real massive impact on my, all parts of my life. I think a thing we may have spoken about before is it came to a point where it became non-negotiable. I needed to try and get to the root of this an issue. I didn't know what it was. Part of me was kind of thinking maybe it was bipolar. I just really didn't have a clue, but what had been generalised anxiety, I just knew there was something else going on. So that's.
And the generalised anxiety disorder diagnosis that you had from earlier, yes. Did that make sense to you for a good piece of time?
Yes, well, it had, because it had anxiety in the title, that's something I could kind of like, I understand that concept, and the generalised piece, then, you kind of learned a bit more about that. And it did, from being a very, very young child, there would have been lots of different instances in that. So the generalised anxiety piece probably would have come up when I was a child, but when I was in college, through the health services when I was in university, that was kind of where anxiety got so, debilitating, at that stage. There was always instances of depression. I used to burn out a lot. You know what I mean? So I think that's what I'm saying about when I was about 36 or so, after so many cycles, maybe the first time that you have some kind of encounter, if you're young out, a teenager or child or whatever, it's always very shocking in that. But once you're getting into your 30s, you're starting to see there's cycles. You kind of have ups, you have downs. There's always a general feeling of this feeling of chaos, maybe more internally. You could be quite high functioning, you mask a lot, but I think that's what I mean. By the time I got to the Dean's Clinic, I'd been self-medicating with drink. I was quite, kind of concerned about my own drinking, but I just knew there was. It's not that I just knew. I was obviously getting indicators externally from family, friends, professionally. I just knew there was something that.
And you mentioned bipolar. Did you have an idea yourself what the diagnosis might be?
No, I didn't, and I think, so I suppose I would know as much as anyone, anybody else would in general society, so anxiety was something, so this would have been like 2016. The concept of anxiety, I think bipolar, it was a thing that kind of came to mind because, I was thinking, isn't that instance of, highs and lows? But I didn't really have I think, when you're unwell, I wasn't like ever acutely unwell. Well, I was probably, but I was masking it very well. And maybe, through my own socioeconomic kind of scenario, situation, and also through support of family and friends, I was able to be unwell, but function. But it's not sustainable,
So when you got the diagnosis of ADHD, how did you feel?
I was very shocked. Completely shocked. I really didn't know anything about it. I just never came across my radar. I really had to go and look it up. I didn't even know what it looked like. Then you start going online and seeing, other people. What does an ADHD person look like? And the whole idea of neurodiversity and being on, the different continuums you can be on. I was completely, I felt, initially I was like, really? What? Because it is a process, it's a long process. There's a lot of, health professions who are involved. A thing that we spoke about before was this parity of esteem. I think that was the piece that I really felt, I would have been kind of in the dark for a long time. You're kind of going online and things. You kind of come through maybe the GP or health services in college. But once I got into the Dean Clinic, and I think the process and the pathway was explained to me, it wasn't going to be a short process. Also, what gave me great confidence is this idea of this differential diagnosis. Do you know what I mean? It's like we're going to exclude, there's as much of an exclusion, because I wasn't seeking. I wanted to know, and I wanted some resolution. I needed some help. But I also wasn't putting my hand up, I wasn't looking for attention. I just wanted to be well. And, so, I was a bit hesitant about going for a diagnosis. So it kind of reassured me that they were kind of like, this is, there's a diagnostic piece to it. We look at all the angles, meeting all those different people, and they explained it. They brought me along the way, So at different instances as it was going on, I really felt I was part of the process, and that made a big difference.
And you mentioned before you got the diagnosis, your family were a huge support to you.
Yes, yeah.
How were they when you got the diagnosis?
So I think when we had spoken before, so as I said, when I was a child, there's different things manifesting that you can kind of that I probably didn't want to remember, or I wouldn't have acknowledged too much. So my parents were incredibly, and my family, my siblings, there's there's 4 of us. So it's 2 boys, 2 girls, and I'm the oldest. They were always very, very protective. But as it transpired when I was going through the whole process, family members and other, reports and things are brought forward. It had transpired that, that it had been flagged that I'd had ADHD as a very young child in 1980s Ireland. You know what I mean? So it probably was a piece at that time where it had definitely been, it had been flagged. I don't think there was the same kind of pathways. I was doing really well at school. There would always be different issues that were coming up, how I played with other children, bullying, all those things, you know what I mean? I think children, you want to be like everyone else. And it, I definitely, as I was moving forward, there was, they could see parts. So your first question was about how my parents, how they took it. So I think that was the shocking piece. For me, I was like, it was a bit of a shock about the diagnosis. Didn't know how I felt about it. Just before that, when I mentioned to my parents that someone's going to be contacting you, and at that stage they were like, oh, actually there's something we need to speak about. So, but at that stage I'd almost had, it was coming out that it looked like an ADHD, so I was in shock and a bit, trying to, reconcile that. And then at the same time, I think for my parents, it was a tricky one for them, and that they always knew it had been flagged. There was nothing had moved on from that, which was absolutely fine at the time. That's how it was. But they had actually probably in the 80s and 90s themselves found their own way of supporting me. And so without any kind of support or care clinically, they just went out and sought information themselves. I think I should add at this stage, I'm the oldest in my family, my nuclear family, and then among my cousins and the wider family, this would have been 2016, a huge amount of cousins, children of my siblings, nieces, nephews were all, this was being flagged, and school was coming up a lot. Some family relations had much more severe aspects of autism or ADHD, and so it was kind of like not a perfect storm, but just...
You getting the diagnosis, did that open up conversations with other family members?
It did, yes, it did. I think it's, so when one person gets a diagnosis, whether they're a parent or a child, and because there's such a genetic aspect to it, of course, that the lens, everyone starts looking internally and thinking back, and people would think back about different situations that would have happened, could that have been avoided, for my parents say, and for my siblings, and also then you've got to think of, through family members, maybe one of my parents as well, so it makes you rethink, you review your interactions. It obviously would make me, you know, review my interactions with, you know, how I've kind of, you know, interacted with people over the years. Things I could have done differently, things that kind of, you know, were out of my control. And I think that's the thing about that diagnosis with mental health. You know, you often don't know when you're unwell, you know, so, but also at a very, very deep level, you really do, you know that there's things are not, you know, that your perception of the world is not the same as other people, you know. But it,
that's right.
yeah,
You
yeah,
do know at
yeah.
some level.
It's just unfortunately it can take a lot of catastrophic things to happen for, you know. But then again, it opens the conversations, you know, across generations. For some years, you know, there's some elements, some people didn't want to have those conversations, you know. I think I probably was, you know, well, I've got a diagnosis, I can get on a regime, this is something I can manage, or we can manage, you know, with the team. And the medication was a game changer for me. It made a huge difference. And I think that actually, by them seeing, you know, once I got into the system, you know what I mean, after a year or two, then people would, you know, maybe they felt more comfortable to bring it up. But yeah, for not just myself, but, you know, for a whole circle of people around it, there's an element of introspection of just, and maybe not guilt, but just thinking back on things.
But like you said, before you went to the Dean Clinic, you went through a period of chaos and real challenge. And obviously people close to you would have seen that.
Yes.
And then they've seen you have the diagnosis, go on medication, and things come out. So it must make it much easier for other people to think then, hang on a minute, is that somebody else that has it as well? Or...
See, I think that's what it was, you know what I mean? I mean, there was, you know, there's not a guilt and blame, and I would have hidden it. And I, you know, I think for girls as well, you're often a little bit, you know, and society, you're a bit better behaved, you know what I mean? So, but with close family and friends would see the internal struggle, they'll see the struggle, you know, the day-to-day chaos, great crack sometimes, really good fun, but it's the frequency and the consistency, it's just like, you know, people are just, they look at you going, what, like, is it bad behavior? What is going on here, you know? So in some ways, it's not that they look at you differently, but, you know, it makes sense in some ways, but more importantly, you actually start viewing other, like, you know, because of the genetic piece, it means that the next generation up, it's not just they're viewed as that's a problem, you know what I mean? Now there's a wider, you know, a kind of a wider conversation about, okay, well, what's going on here, you know? And it's the thing about it's the frequency of it as well. I mean, you know, we're all badly behaved. Everyone, we're chaotic, and that's fine. But it's when there's a frequency, you know, you know, what's the reasoning, you know? But you also have to take responsibility yourself about that was just a bad behavior situation. But there would have been times, I think when you're a child, you can't mask as well. So you can see there was times where I would be as shocked as the next person, even though I might have carried out the bold, you know, ran away from school, or, you know, loads of instances of that. Just you know, and
I was actually going to ask you that question about responsibility and whether you'd ever blame your condition for the way you behaved.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, you can kind of think about, you know, so if I grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, God, it was just this, you know, you kind of come from a place of just suck it up. You know what I mean? I didn't want the diagnosis. I needed to, you know, things became non-negotiable. I just, you know, it was really difficult to keep coping. You know, the burnouts, it was just the cycles. It was, you know, it was your quality of life. It just got exhausting, I know, and very dark at certain times. And, you know, so for me, it was just a case of like, I can't do this anymore. But at the same time, I didn't want a diagnosis. I didn't, you know, I wanted to be well, whatever that means. So I was ashamed of it as well, you know. I was ashamed of any kind of, you know, but, sorry, I don't know if that answered your question, sorry. Yeah,
sort of, yeah. And I suppose just that bit about being ashamed of the diagnosis, because I think you're right, everybody has this perception of what well or normal is like. And how did you manage that, internalizing your diagnosis and moving on with life? How did you manage it?
I think because the process of getting a diagnosis, it's over, you know, a 6, you know, it can, depending on, you know, it can be a 6 months a year. It was a year process, you know. But I understood, you know, what the trajectory was and what, you know, the rationale for bringing different people in and doing different interviews and things like that. And you know, so when you get the diagnosis, you know, there's a period of like elation or some feeling of like, okay, well, there's a name or a label. Again, just going back to your previous, you don't want the label. You know, now it's, you know, there is a piece of like, you know, neurodiverse, you know, it's woke and it's, you know, but, you know, I probably come from a generation where it's just crack on. Like, you don't want, you know what I mean? It's, you know, it was a pre-social media thing. You don't want to have, you know, if you want to stand out, you want to stand out for good, socially acceptable things. You don't want to be standing out because of a diagnosis or a label. And I think even now I would have more stigma still about that than, you know, I mean, even if I talk to other people or I work with younger people who have it and I disclose and I'm very comfortable, but internally I still really struggle with it actually, you know, I just, you know, but it's probably because I wasn't diagnosed for so many years. And I think, you know, so the generalizing anxiety, a lot of that was stemming from, you know, not having any diagnosis, not understanding it and not being able, you know, trying to manage it. You kind of have your own kind of tips and tricks or being evasive of certain things and just, but even for people around me, you know, for people who love me, trying to help me or support me or just even, you know, be around me. And, you know, having the label, if you will, meant that now we have a, you know, a kind of a domain where we can actually, you know, try to understand things a bit better. But I think by having a diagnosis so late, you know, and I'm saying the medication, it really makes you look back going like, how did you, there's so many instances where it's like, you know, I've got this far. You can hit certain kind of, you know, lifetime markers or whatever, but it didn't need to be so difficult. It didn't need to be so hard. I probably would have made different decisions in my life choices, and that's, you know, it is, we all could say that, but, you know, in terms of having children, you know, genetically you feel just, you know, there was an element of feeling contaminated or not right. And
that's really difficult.
yes, it is, but that's what I'm saying about the internalizing piece of it, you know. So as a child, it would be things like I would get tested for hearing, you mimic voices, you don't know, you don't trust yourself, you don't trust your own internal voice. It means that you can be very easily swayed as a teenager. You'll overcompensate in certain parts, which is, you know, that's the real, you know, the superpower of it, you know, the hyper focus, and that is, that's a form of self-medication as well, whether it's work or you become very, like we would be quite extroverted, but it takes a lot, it took a lot of work. And it's the internalizing part of it, the self-medication, it was, you know, self-sabotage, it was, and that, you think it's just you, that's, you know, nobody can see this, it's fine, it's you know, but it has a huge impact. Everybody you encounter, everyone you meet, all the people in your life, it does have a bearing on everyone else. And I think that was a really interesting piece where I got my diagnosis, you know, oh, well done you, but it's, you know, it ripples out, you know, and it also gives you a sense more of empowerment where, you know, you want to be able to be a carer or be, you know, a well person. You know, if you're a healthy, well person, then you could be of use to other people and society. But if you have that internal piece that you're just not getting the picture, or you're kind of always a little bit off the, you know, you're not getting the message or something. You're kind of, you're always you're always second guessing. You know, you become quite good at reading situations and using emotional therapy. You know, you use lots of other skill sets, but that can kind of come across sometimes maybe as being manipulative, or, you know, it's you know, but it's just their ways of coping with things, you know what I mean? But equally so for other people, and that's probably what I mean about, you know, not having family. Like, there's loads of reasons for that, but in terms of having relationships, having children, there was always probably a part of, you know, you're afraid, you know, if you can't, you know, if you're keeping yourself alive and keeping your own things normal, you know, you feel you're not responsible as a citizen or in society to care for others, you know. So it has a really strange, deeper knock-on effect. So having the diagnosis in some ways kind of, I felt I was coming back into society. You know, I knew where I could feel a bit, you know, and now because things have moved on so much in this current generation, says Granny here, you know, there is a better understanding, and I'd hate to think that, you know, other children or, you know, young adults coming up, it doesn't have to be that difficult, you know.
It's really interesting you say that it's allowed you to sort of feel whole again, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, what a horrible thing to have to grow up, particularly through teenage years, which are tough at the best of times, you know, not feeling complete in a way.
Yes, your identity. It's, you know, I think that's the strangest thing. You know, I always thought it was, you know, with the self-medication, it was, you know, when I got my diagnosis, 36, 37, I felt like I was 15 again. It's like, you're not reinventing yourself, but you're just, the lens of everything you've known before, you realize it's like actually, you know, that it was a particular lens, you know, and, you know, it's just, you know, so then you start to see things from a few different other angles, and you see, you know, it's like your interaction with yourself, but I don't think it has such a bearing on your interaction with other people, and then you become much more of a, you know, part of society. You feel, you know, that you can give something back, and for many years, and you feel your identity that you're less than, you know, that's a really important, you know, you feel it's a different, like, identities change every decade, you know, different periods of life, things change with different cycles, but, you know, I think that was, when you said the first diagnosis, that was shocking, because it was, you know, you're in a place of, it was really existential, where the identity and the behaviours and the patterns, they weren't working, they hadn't been working for an awful long time, but I had much more insight. And then, of course, with the medication and then other, you know, therapeutics, you know, that, I think that's the next bit. It's like, and now it's like, okay, there is a pathway, you know, this, you know, there, you know, you feel, it's very alone, you can feel very alone.
Sounds like you've done a phenomenal amount of work since 2016 in terms of yourself.
It's interesting you say that, because when I was speaking to some other colleagues and some other friends of mine, you know, like, I have, yes, but even in more recent years, again, I seem to have, you know, I haven't finished the work. You know, there's a few, you know, I've started getting, you know, but now I can distinguish between these are just life situations. This is a reason why you feel down or manic or upset or angry, whatever. You can, you know, there's a much more of a kind of a cause and effect thing. But yeah, I think even as I'm getting older, the menopause, I think, the hormonal thing, which about, you know, I'm just, again, it's the thing with the meds, you know, but I've just found myself, it's funny you say that, in the last few weeks and months going, shit, I thought I'd done the work.
More work to come.
But it's different. I need to go back and rethink about, you know, certain other things have happened in life, as they do, you know, but maybe how I've been approaching them was the old way before I was diagnosed. I just need to reset. Like, yeah, so I've gone back into, I think that's the piece. The medication is amazing, but the therapeutics piece, the, you know, talk therapy, the OT, I was like, you know, maybe the arrogance and being, I'm high functioning, you know, I did a bit of that. I didn't really, you know, do a lot of work in that. So I found I do need to go, I know I have gone back again to improve. Yeah, so a few weeks ago I would have been like, I thought this was, you know, diagnosis, tick box, crack on, everything's fine. But it's all part of that recovery piece. But, you know, but it's still shocking. I don't know, was it 2016? It's still, what is it, maybe 10 years on. And, you know, there is an element of me realizing, going, oh, you know, it still has impacts. But at least, but now I have an actual trajectory.
Yeah, you have a plan on where to go. But, you know, as we change, you know, you know, and grow and new situations arise, of course things are going to change. Yeah, yeah.
And again, it's that thing of, I'm still with the same team. And I think having that continuity, I can, you know, I had a lot of care at a particular period around the diagnosis, before the aftermath, sorry. No, I don't mean it that way, but, and then I was able to, you know, come and go, and I was able to manage. I think that's what I mean by the party. I felt like a response, you know, I was part of my own management of it. But, you know, I realized, you know, I've gone back and I've probably been a bit, disclosed more to them again, and now they're actually helping me again, you know, you know, so my interaction didn't just stop at just the diagnosis and see ya, you know, and going back and getting checked for prescriptions, you know, it's, you know.
That's lovely to hear that there's still that recovery journey that, you know.
It's moved on, obviously our relationship, and you know, there is, and we're kind of discovering things together, do you know what I mean? And, you know, and then maybe I'm hoping it's interesting for them as well, you know, how many people are on meds for how long, you know what I mean, if you haven't been on as a child, and if you start older, and what doses work, and there's all these pieces. But working that together, you get that self-management, but there's definitely, going back to them again, and where they've referred me next, you know, they're an amazing team, and I'm very lucky. But maybe it was the social, you know, this part of it was actually me seeking it. Part of it was my parents did inform themselves. And I was able to get a place there with them. But yeah, my relationship with the team, you know what I mean? It's changed again in a you know, and that's an interesting,
really interesting story of a pathway through your diagnosis.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.